You step through the heavy oak doors of Hogwarts Castle on a misty October evening, wondering if anyone has ever actually counted all the rooms in this impossible building, and immediately you notice something peculiar about the seventh floor corridor near the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy. You walk past the woven image of trolls in tutus 3 times while concentrating very hard on needing a place to hide, which feels slightly ridiculous until a polished door materializes in the stone wall like butter melting in reverse. The room of requirement stands before you now, its entrance shimmering with the kind of magic that makes you question whether architecture has been lying to you your entire life. You push the door open and find yourself in a space that shouldn't exist according to any known laws of physics or geometry, filled with towering stacks of forgotten objects that stretch toward a ceiling lost in shadows. The room smells like old parchment, dust, and something faintly metallic that reminds you of the way air tastes before a thunderstorm. You wonder how many students have discovered this place over the centuries, how many secrets have been whispered into its ever-changing walls, and whether the room itself keeps a record of all the desperate wishes that have summoned it into existence. What you might not realize as you run your fingers along a tarnished mirror frame is that this magical space has roots stretching back to 1142, when a group of Benedictine monks first enchanted a dormitory in what would eventually become Hogwarts Castle. The monks had been experimenting with adaptive architecture after reading translated Arabic texts on mathematical spacefolding, which they had acquired during the Second Crusade, though they probably weren't expecting their ecclesiastical bedroom to develop a personality quite this accommodating. Historical records from the Winchester Cathedral archives mention a chamber of charitable transformation that responded to the earnest requirements of those in spiritual distress, which is medieval monk speak for magic room that gives you what you need. You examine a stack of broken wands nearby and consider that the room of requirement is essentially Hogwarts' way of being a really attentive host, the kind that remembers you're allergic to shellfish and also that you once mentioned you collect 17th century thimbles. The original monastic version of this space was considerably less flashy, designed primarily to provide appropriate environments for different types of penance, which sounds incredibly depressing until you realize that medieval monks considered penance to include things like quiet contemplation with adequate lighting and a warm place to study without Brother Edmund's snoring. You pick your way between precarious towers of cauldrons and wonder if the room judges you for what you ask it to become, though you suspect it's seen far stranger requests than yours over the past 9 centuries. The concept of responsive architecture wasn't unique to magical Britain in the 12th century, as Islamic builders had been incorporating adaptive geometric patterns into mosques since the 9th century, creating spaces that seemed to shift with the light and the prayers of the faithful. You pause next to a collection of dusty portraits, whose subjects have long since abandoned their frames, leaving behind only faded backgrounds of gardens and battlements. What makes the room of requirement particularly special isn't just that it changes, but that it appears to understand context in ways that suggest either remarkable artificial intelligence or the magical equivalent of really good customer service. Scholars at the Institute for Architectural Thaumaturgy in Prague have been debating for decades whether the room possesses actual consciousness or simply operates on extraordinarily sophisticated conditional enchantments, which is basically arguing about whether your smartphone is alive or just very good at pretending. You notice a broken sneakoscope spinning lazily in a corner and reflect that this room has probably witnessed more rule-breaking than any Hogwarts professor would care to contemplate. The historical transition from monastic meditation chamber to general-purpose magical space apparently occurred around 1287, when the 4 Hogwarts founders incorporated the existing structure into their expanding castle, though they each had very different ideas about what the room should prioritize. Godric Gryffindor wanted it to emphasize courage and honor, which translated to lots of red curtains and motivational tapestries. Rowena Ravenclaw lobbied for the room to enhance intellectual pursuits, suggesting it default to a well-lit library configuration with ergonomic seating. Helga Hufflepuff insisted it should provide comfort and nourishment, leading to heated debates about whether magical architecture should include kitchen facilities, which apparently was controversial even in the 13th century. Salazar Slytherin argued the room should help users achieve their ambitions regardless of ethical implications, which is how you end up with a magical space that will happily become a torture chamber if you ask it nicely enough, though you hope no one has actually tested that particular limit. You squeeze between a grandfather clock that chimes in what sounds like ancient Greek and a stack of books whose titles have been worn away by centuries of curious fingers. The room's ability to provide exactly what you need rather than what you think you want suggests a level of intuition that borders on unsettling, like having a friend who's a little too good at reading your emotional state. You consider that the Room of Requirement might be Hogwarts' subconscious mind made manifest, a physical representation of the castle's desire to nurture and protect its students, though that theory gets weird when you remember the room also stores dark artifacts and provides space for clandestine meetings that definitely violate school policy. Medieval records indicate that the original monastic chamber developed its adaptive properties accidentally after a particularly powerful blessing ceremony coincided with a rare astronomical alignment and a nearby ley line intersection, which is the magical equivalent of winning the lottery while being struck by lightning during a solar eclipse. You run your hand along a cracked mirror and see your reflection multiplied into infinity, each iteration slightly different, as if the mirror is showing you all the versions of yourself that exist in parallel timelines where you made different choices. The room's temperature shifts subtly as you move through it, somehow maintaining the perfect climate for whatever you're standing next to, which would be incredibly useful for wine storage if Hogwarts allowed students to have wine, which it definitely doesn't, at least not officially. Archaeological evidence from renovations in the 1890s revealed that the space beneath the Room of Requirement contains layers of even older construction, including what appears to be a Roman-era foundation, suggesting that this location has been considered magically significant for at least 2,000 years. You spot a collection of old Hogwarts uniforms from various eras, the styles shifting from medieval robes to Victorian-fitted jackets to the more casual modern designs, each generation of students leaving their mark on this impossible archive. The fact that the room maintains everything in a state of preserved decay, rather than pristine restoration, suggests it understands the value of patina and history, appreciating that objects become more meaningful as they age and collect stories. You wonder whether the room ever gets tired of being needed, whether it dreams of being something permanent instead of constantly shape-shifting to accommodate the latest crisis or secret romance or exam preparation panic. Current magical theorists at the Department of Mysteries have proposed that the Room of Requirement operates on a principle they call intentional resonance, where the room doesn't actually read minds, but instead responds to magical signatures in the ambient field generated by strong emotion and clear purpose, which sounds scientific until you remember they're essentially describing wish fulfillment through applied willpower. You navigate around a stack of broken broomsticks and consider that this collection represents countless Quidditch accidents, each one a small tragedy for some long-graduated student who probably blamed the broom when it was really their own overconfidence during a difficult turn. The room's western wall appears to be lined with old potion bottles containing liquids in colors that shouldn't exist, ranging from a purple so deep it looks like a bruise on reality to a yellow that seems to emit its own light like bottled sunshine. The interconnection between the Room of Requirement and other hidden spaces in Hogwarts suggests a complex system of magical architecture that functions almost like a nervous system for the castle itself, with this room serving as a kind of central hub or switching station. You pick up a small bronze key and wonder what it once opened, what secret it protected, and whether the door it fit still exists somewhere in the castle's ever-shifting layout. The historical record shows that during the 1612 Goblin Rebellion, the room provided sanctuary for 43 students and 5 professors for nearly 2 weeks, somehow producing enough food and water to sustain them despite having no apparent connection to the kitchens or any logical source of supplies. You examine a faded photograph in a broken frame showing a group of students from the 1920s laughing at something beyond the image's edge, their faces full of the kind of joy that transcends time and reminds you that teenagers have been sneaking around and breaking curfew for centuries. The room's ability to hide itself completely when danger approaches, becoming not just invisible but actually non-existent until the threat passes, raises fascinating questions about the nature of magical space and whether locations can have a sense of self-preservation. You notice a collection of old chocolate frog cards scattered across a dusty table, the famous witches and wizards depicted there representing a cross-section of magical history that would make any collector weep with envy, assuming they could get past the protective enchantments that have probably accumulated on everything in here like supernatural dust. Medieval chronicles mention that the room once provided a chamber of reconciliation for 2 feuding wizards who were locked inside until they resolved their differences, which took 3 days and resulted in either a lasting friendship or mutual suicide pact, depending on which version of the story you believe. You step over a pile of old cauldrons, each one bearing the scorch marks and stains of potions gone wrong, testament to the fact that magical education has always involved a certain amount of explosive trial and error. The room's southeastern corner contains what appears to be a complete apothecary shop from the 18th century, with hundreds of small drawers labeled in faded handwriting, each one presumably containing ingredients that are either fantastically rare or fantastically dangerous, or both. You consider that the Room of Requirement is essentially a 3-dimensional archive of Hogwarts' collective unconscious, storing not just objects, but the emotional residue of 1,000 years of adolescent drama, academic pressure, and the peculiar intensity that comes from learning magic while your hormones are trying to kill you. Current debates among magical historians focus on whether the room's contents are actually stored here, physically, or exist in some kind of extra-dimensional pocket space that the room accesses like a magical filing system, pulling items from the void based on some inscrutable organizational principle. You find a stack of old journals bound in cracked leather, their pages filled with the private thoughts of students long dead, their hopes and fears preserved in fading ink that reminds you everyone who attended Hogwarts was once as young and uncertain as you are now. The room's northern section appears dedicated to military artifacts from various wizarding conflicts, including wands that have been snapped in half as punishment, shields bearing family crests of extinct bloodlines, and what looks suspiciously like a cursed medieval helmet that's given you 3 headaches just from looking at it. You wonder if the room organizes itself thematically, or if the arrangement is completely chaotic, objects landing wherever they fall when someone abandons them in this magical lost and found. Historical accounts from the 1745 Jacobite Rising mention that the room provided strategic planning space for Scottish wizards who were trying to keep magical and Muggle conflicts separate, though they apparently weren't entirely successful given how messy that whole situation became. You discover a collection of old magical instruments whose purposes you can't even guess, devices of brass and crystal and wood that look like they belong in either an observatory or a torture chamber, or possibly both. The room's ceiling, when you can glimpse it through the towers of junk, appears to be decorated with constellations that don't match any astronomical charts you've studied, suggesting either creative license or the existence of stars visible only to magical observation. You pick up a small music box that plays a melody you don't recognize, something haunting and beautiful that makes you feel nostalgic for a time you never experienced, which is either very sophisticated magic or just the normal effect of old music boxes on the human psyche. The scholarly consensus suggests that the Room of Requirements magic is tied directly to Hogwarts' founding enchantments, making it one of the most ancient and powerful magical constructs in Britain, though nobody can quite agree on whether it was intentionally created or spontaneously emerged from the castle's accumulated magic like a pearl forming around an irritant in an oyster. You navigate through a section filled with broken furniture from various eras, chairs with 3 legs, tables with cracks down the middle, desks carved with the initials of students who are now great-grandparents or dust. The room's ability to provide practice space for everything from defense against the dark arts to ballroom dancing suggests it has observed enough human behavior to understand what people need, even when they can't articulate it themselves, which is either touching or creepy, depending on your tolerance for omniscient architecture. You find a stack of old Daily Prophet newspapers, their headlines screaming about crises that have long since been resolved or forgotten, reminding you that today's emergency becomes tomorrow's historical footnote if you just wait long enough. The eastern wall features what appears to be a gallery of magical portraits that were removed from other parts of the castle for being too controversial, too chatty, too prone to insulting passers-by, or in one case, too accurate at predicting student romantic entanglements, which apparently made everyone uncomfortable. You consider that every object in this room represents a moment when someone decided something was no longer useful or wanted, yet the room preserves everything, suggesting it has a fundamentally different relationship with value and disposal than humans do. Archaeological surveys using modern magical scanning techniques have revealed that the room's physical footprint changes not just internally, but externally, sometimes occupying significantly more or less space than the castle's exterior dimensions would suggest is possible, which violates several fundamental laws of magical architecture and gives the Department of Mysteries persistent headaches. You discover a collection of old Hogwarts acceptance letters, presumably from students who never attended, each one a path not taken, a magical education abandoned before it began for reasons you can only imagine. The room's southern section contains what looks like a complete history of magic classroom from the 1600s, complete with uncomfortable wooden benches and a chalkboard still covered in notes about the Goblin Wars, as if the teacher just stepped out for a moment 300 years ago and never came back. You find yourself wondering whether the room has favorites among the students who use it, whether it's more generous with some than others, or if it maintains perfect neutrality like a really dedicated public servant. Medieval records indicate that certain dark wizards attempted to claim the room for themselves through various binding spells, all of which failed spectacularly because the room apparently doesn't appreciate being owned and responds to attempted enslavement by becoming completely inaccessible, which suggests it has at least enough agency to be petty when offended. You spot a collection of old wands arranged in a display case, each one representing a wizard who died or retired or simply lost their primary tool, the wood grain and core materials as individual as fingerprints. The room's northwestern corner features what appears to be a complete set of furniture from a Victorian-era common room, all overstuffed chairs and dark wood paneling, preserved as if waiting for ghosts to come back and resume their eternal card game. You consider the irony that the Room of Requirement, which exists to be needed, is itself filled with things that are no longer needed, making it simultaneously the most useful and most useless space in the castle. Current magical theorists debate whether the room could theoretically be destroyed, or if its nature as responsive space makes it effectively immortal, capable of simply disappearing and reappearing elsewhere if threatened, like a magical hermit crab finding a new shell. You find a stack of old textbooks from subjects that are no longer taught, including advanced alchemy, wandless levitation, and something called practical ethics for the ambitious wizard, which you suspect was discontinued for obvious reasons. The room's ability to provide exactly the right book, tool, or space at the right time suggests either incredible magical sophistication or the universe's weirdest coincidence generator. And honestly, after several years at Hogwarts, you're not sure there's much difference. You discover a collection of broken hourglasses, their sand frozen mid-flow, as if time itself got tired and decided to take a nap in this particular corner of the castle. The historical evidence suggests that the Room of Requirement has survived at least 4 major attacks on Hogwarts by simply not existing during the dangerous moments, which is either the ultimate survival strategy or cosmic-level cowardice, depending on your perspective. You navigate past a tower of old cauldrons and wonder how many of these vessels were abandoned after producing potions so terrible they convinced students to change career paths entirely, choosing safe, potion-free futures in departments where explosions are less frequent. You descend a spiral staircase hidden behind a tapestry on the 2nd floor, your footsteps echoing off stone walls that have absorbed centuries of secrets, and you realize that you're heading toward the most infamous hidden chamber in all of Hogwarts, the Chamber of Secrets itself. The passageway grows narrower as you descend, the air becoming cooler and damper with each step, carrying the smell of ancient water and something mineral that reminds you of the inside of caves. You wonder how many students have walked this path, how many have stood at the entrance to Salazar Slytherin's legendary chamber and felt the same mixture of dread and fascination that's currently making your stomach perform acrobatics. The walls here are different from the rest of Hogwarts, older somehow. The stone darker and smoother as if worn by water or time or both. You reach the bottom of the stairs and find yourself in a corridor decorated with serpentine sculptures that seem to watch your progress with emerald eyes that catch the light of your wand. What you might not know as you examine these ancient carvings is that the Chamber of Secrets was built atop the ruins of a 2nd century Roman bathhouse that served the military garrison stationed at what would eventually become Hogsmeade. Archaeological evidence discovered during the 1993 incident revealed that Slytherin didn't actually construct the chamber from nothing, but rather repurposed and expanded an existing underground complex that had been abandoned for nearly 800 years by the time he arrived. The Romans had built their bathhouse on this site because of the natural hot springs and the convergence of underground water channels, which they believed had healing properties, though they probably didn't realize they were also building on top of a magical power nexus that would later prove irresistible to one of Hogwarts' founders. You run your hand along the wall and feel the transition between Roman stonework and medieval construction, the Romans favoring smaller, more regular blocks, while Slytherin's additions feature larger, more dramatically carved pieces that announce their magical purpose through sheer scale. The historical record shows that the Roman garrison at this location numbered approximately 200 soldiers and their families, serving as a northern outpost during Emperor Hadrian's consolidation of Britain between 122 and 138 AD. You pause at a junction where 3 passages converge and wonder which one leads to the actual chamber, though you suspect the correct answer involves speaking Parseltongue to a decorative snake sculpture, which seems like exactly the kind of security system an extremely paranoid wizard would implement. The Romans' original bathhouse complex included a caldarium for hot baths, a tepidarium for warm baths, a frigidarium for cold plunges, and an elaborate hypocaust system for underfloor heating, all of which Slytherin essentially converted into a drainage and ventilation network for his secret monster habitat. You consider the irony that a space designed for public bathing and social gathering became the hiding place for a basilisk whose gaze could kill you, which is quite the architectural rebranding. Medieval chronicles suggest that Slytherin discovered the Roman ruins in 1004 while exploring the underground water systems he was planning to incorporate into Hogwarts plumbing, because apparently even 1,000 years ago, wizards understood that functional bathrooms were non-negotiable for a successful boarding school. You examine a section of wall where Roman tilework is still visible beneath layers of magical construction, the geometric patterns typical of 2nd century British Roman design, all interlocking squares and diamonds in faded reds and blues. The bathhouse would have served not just hygienic purposes, but social and political ones as well, providing a space where soldiers could relax, gossip, conduct business, and maintain the civilized Roman identity that separated them from what they considered the barbaric Britons they'd conquered. You notice carved niches in the walls that once held statues or oil lamps, now empty and dark, their original contents either stolen by treasure hunters or removed by Slytherin when he converted this place into something decidedly less welcoming. Current debates among magical historians focus on whether Slytherin chose this location specifically because of its Roman history, or simply because it provided convenient underground space, though recent discoveries suggest he may have been influenced by Roman magical texts that describe the site as having special properties. You navigate through a section where the ceiling is supported by what are clearly Roman columns, their capitals carved in the Corinthian style, with acanthus leaves that have somehow survived a millennium underground. The Romans' decision to build here wasn't random. Geological surveys have confirmed that this location sits atop a natural aquifer fed by several underground streams, making it perfect for a bathhouse, but also creating the perpetually damp environment that large serpents apparently find comfortable. You spot fragments of Roman pottery scattered in corners, pieces of amphorae that once held wine or olive oil or garum that fermented fish sauce Romans found delicious and everyone else finds horrifying. The transition from public bath to secret chamber required significant magical and mundane construction, including the installation of the massive door mechanism that only opens to Parseltongue, which Slytherin apparently commissioned from a group of wizarding engineers who were later obliviated to maintain security, because nothing says trust like magically erasing your contractor's memories. You examine what appears to be part of the original Roman heating system, channels in the floor that once carried hot air from a furnace now repurposed as drainage for the chamber's perpetual water problems. The scholarly consensus suggests that Slytherin spent approximately 15 years converting the Roman ruins into the Chamber of Secrets, working primarily in secret with only occasional assistance from trusted allies, which means he dedicated a significant portion of his adult life to building a lair for a monster he planned to unleash on students who didn't meet his blood purity standards, which really puts his whole ambitious personality trait into a darker context. You discover a section of mosaic floor that the Romans left behind, depicting Neptune with his trident surrounded by dolphins and sea creatures. The tiles still bright after 2,000 years underground, thanks to either excellent Roman craftsmanship or residual magical protection. The Romans' presence in Britain was controversial even in their own time, with senators in Rome debating whether the province was worth the military expense, though they probably never imagined their abandoned bathhouse would eventually host a magical boarding school's darkest secret. You navigate past a series of carved snake heads that function as water spouts, Slytherin's addition to the Roman infrastructure, their mouths open in eternal silent hisses that probably seemed really intimidating to him, but now just look like committed aesthetic dedication. Medieval records indicate that the other Hogwarts founders were initially unaware of Slytherin's secret project, believing he was simply installing an advanced drainage system, which technically wasn't completely a lie, though it definitely involved more giant serpents than typically associated with plumbing. You find evidence of Roman graffiti scratched into the stone, soldiers' names and dates, and crude drawings that remind you that bored young men have been vandalizing things for millennia, their ancient doodles making them suddenly relatable across the vast expanse of time. The chamber's main entrance features a door carved with 7 serpents, a design Slytherin apparently spent months perfecting because he wanted visitors to feel appropriately intimidated before potentially being murdered by his pet basilisk, which shows a real commitment to theme consistency. You consider that the Romans would probably be horrified to know their nice communal bathing facility became the headquarters for magical snake-based eugenics. Though Roman history has its own share of morally questionable moments, so they're not really in a position to judge. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Roman bathhouse was abandoned around 410 AD, when Rome withdrew its legions from Britain, leaving the building to slowly fill with water and sediment over the centuries until it became nothing more than a local legend about cursed springs that Slytherin later investigated. You discover fragments of Roman medical instruments in a side chamber, suggesting the bathhouse complex included a healing area where military physicians treated injured soldiers, which adds another layer to the site's transformation from a place of healing to a place of deliberate harm. The Romans' sophisticated understanding of hydraulic engineering meant their bathhouse featured hot and cold running water, temperature-controlled rooms, and an elaborate drainage system, all of which Slytherin preserved and enhanced with magic, because even dark wizards appreciate good infrastructure. You examine a section of wall where Latin inscriptions are still visible, dedications to various Roman gods asking for protection, health, and victory, prayers that went unanswered when the empire crumbled and left its British outposts to fend for themselves. Current magical theorists debate whether the basilisk Slytherin placed in the chamber was bred specifically for the purpose, or whether he discovered it elsewhere and simply relocated it, though ancient breeding records are understandably sparse for creatures that can kill you by making eye contact. You navigate through what was clearly the caldarium, the hot bathroom, its pool now empty except for a few inches of stagnant water that reflects your wand light in oily colors. The Romans believed that bathing wasn't just about cleanliness, but about maintaining the social order, the bathhouse serving as a place where class distinctions temporarily dissolved in the warm water, though obviously those distinctions reasserted themselves immediately upon drying off. You spot more evidence of Roman tilework, pieces of opus tessellatum featuring geometric patterns, and occasionally more elaborate scenes of gods or heroes, their colors muted by centuries, but still visible if you look carefully. The chamber's connection to the Hogwarts plumbing system, which Slytherin designed to include access points throughout the castle, demonstrates a level of forward thinking that's impressive, even if the ultimate goal was delivering a giant murder snake to unsuspecting Muggle-borns. You discover what appears to be a Roman altar in a side chamber dedicated to Fortuna, the goddess of luck and fate, which seems grimly appropriate given that surviving a basilisk attack definitely requires both. Medieval accounts suggest that Slytherin's departure from Hogwarts in 1015 was precipitated by the other founders discovering his chamber, though they were unable to find or seal it despite extensive searches, which must have been incredibly frustrating for them and probably led to some very tense staff meetings. You examine graffiti from multiple eras, Roman soldiers' names next to medieval mason marks next to what appears to be Tom Riddle's signature from the 1940s, each generation adding their mark to this underground space. The Romans' original entrance to the bathhouse would have been a grand affair with columns and steps leading down from ground level, but that entrance has long since been buried or destroyed, replaced by Slytherin's secret passages and hidden doorways that only the worthy, or at least the murderous, can access. You navigate past evidence of the Hippocaust system, the raised floor that allowed hot air to circulate underneath, brick pillars still standing after 2 millennia like the tombstones of imperial ambition. Historical evidence suggests that the Roman garrison stationed here included soldiers from across the empire, including men from Syria, North Africa, and the Germanic provinces, making this remote British outpost surprisingly cosmopolitan, though they all eventually shared the same fate of abandonment when Rome recalled its legions. You find fragments of Roman glassware, pieces of bottles and cups that caught the light when they were whole, now reduced to cloudy shards that crunch under your feet like very expensive gravel. The chamber's most impressive feature is its massive statue of Salazar Slytherin himself, which he apparently commissioned while still alive because modesty was not his defining characteristic, the stone face glaring down with an expression that suggests he took himself extremely seriously. You consider that building a hidden chamber, installing a giant snake, carving a self-congratulatory statue, and developing an elaborate security system is a lot of effort just to make a point about blood purity, which really highlights how people's worst ideas often inspire their greatest energy. Archaeological surveys have revealed that the chamber extends much deeper than previously thought, with sealed sections that may contain additional Roman ruins or possibly more of Slytherin's handiwork, though nobody is eager to explore further given what lived in the accessible parts. You discover evidence of Roman writing tablets, the wax long since melted away, but the wooden frames remaining, silent witnesses to correspondence and record-keeping from an empire that considered itself eternal but turned out to be decidedly finite. The chamber's acoustics are remarkable, sounds echoing in strange ways that make whispers carry and footsteps boom, possibly an accidental feature of the Roman architecture, or possibly something Slytherin enhanced to make the space more terrifying, because apparently the giant murder snake wasn't atmosphere enough. You examine the water channels that run throughout the complex, following the natural underground streams the Romans first tapped, now serving as highways for basilisks and escape routes for students who really should have stayed in bed that day. Current debates among scholars focus on whether other Hogwarts founders built similar hidden chambers that simply haven't been discovered yet, though hopefully none of them included deadly creatures, or if they did, at least creatures with better moral frameworks than kill everyone who isn't pure-blooded. You find more Roman pottery, including a nearly complete oil lamp shaped like a foot, because Romans had weird decorative tastes, their sense of humor surviving in clay form for 2,000 years underground. The Romans' withdrawal from Britain was gradual and chaotic, a slow collapse rather than a sudden departure, leaving behind infrastructure that local populations couldn't maintain and didn't fully understand. Buildings slowly becoming ruins that later generations would view with superstition and wonder. You navigate through sections where medieval and Roman construction are thoroughly mixed, Slytherin's stonework incorporating Roman columns as supports, creating an architectural palimpsest that reflects both cultures' obsession with permanence through stone. The chamber's purpose as a safeguard for Slytherin's pure vision of magical education reveals how easily high ideals can corrupt into justifications for violence, a lesson that remains relevant regardless of the century or the civilization. You spot what might be fragments of Roman armor, rust-eaten metal that once protected soldiers who believed they were defending civilization against barbarism, never imagining their bathhouse would outlast their empire and serve much darker purposes. The transformation of the space, from communal healing to isolated threat, mirrors larger patterns in human history. The way places designed for bringing people together can be repurposed for keeping them apart. You examine evidence of the Roman drainage system, carefully engineered channels that still function after 2 millennia, proving that good infrastructure transcends the rise and fall of empires, and even the worst intentions of dark wizards who repurpose it. You emerge from the Chamber of Secrets feeling slightly damp and considerably more educated about Roman civil engineering than you expected, and you find yourself in another hidden passage that winds through the castle's foundations like the veins in a vast stone body. The passage walls here show evidence of construction from multiple eras, medieval stonework patched with Tudor period repairs, Victorian-era reinforcement added to Norman foundations, creating a geological record of architectural anxiety about whether this entire massive structure might collapse at any moment. You wonder how Hogwarts has remained standing for 1,000 years, given that significant portions of it seem to operate on principles that make engineers weep and physicists question their career choices. The air in these deep passages smells like earth and old magic, a combination that's both comforting and slightly concerning. Like discovering your grandmother has been keeping secrets, but they're probably benign secrets about hidden cookie stashes, rather than malevolent ones about cursed artifacts. You navigate past a junction where 5 different passages converge, each one leading to a different hidden section of the castle, and you reflect that Hogwarts builders seemed pathologically opposed to straightforward architecture, preferring instead a design philosophy best described as, what if we made everything as confusing as possible and also added some moving staircases just for fun? Medieval records indicate that the castle's complex system of hidden passages began as practical escape routes during the periodic conflicts between wizards and witch hunters, but quickly expanded into a sprawling network that served every purpose from smuggling goods to avoiding awkward encounters with ex-romantic partners. You discover a small chamber containing what appears to be a medieval scriptorium, where monks once copied magical texts by candlelight, their centuries-old ink still visible on parchment fragments scattered across stone desks. The scholarly debates about whether Hogwarts' hidden passages were intentionally designed as an integrated system or simply accumulated organically over time basically comes down to arguing whether the castle is brilliantly chaotic or chaotically brilliant, a distinction that probably matters more to academics than to students trying not to get caught out after curfew. You examine carved stones bearing mason marks from builders who worked on the castle in the 1170s, their personal symbols representing individual craftsmen whose names are lost, but whose work literally holds up the school, which is either a nice metaphor about anonymous contributors to history or a depressing reminder that we forget most people pretty quickly. The passage slopes downward here, taking you deeper into the bedrock that Hogwarts rests upon, and you consider that the castle is less a building sitting on top of the earth and more a structure that has been partially absorbed by it, roots of stone reaching deep into the Scottish Highlands. You spot evidence of a collapsed section that was hastily repaired in what looks like the 1850s, using whatever materials were available at the time, resulting in a patch that includes normal stone blocks, pieces of broken statuary, and what might be parts of old cauldrons melted down and reformed because apparently Victorian wizards believed in aggressive recycling. Current theories among magical architects suggest that Hogwarts actively maintains its own structure through ambient magic absorbed from generations of students and professors, essentially making it a living building that repairs itself slowly over time, which explains why obviously dangerous structural problems somehow never result in catastrophic failures. You discover a side passage that leads to what appears to be a medieval storage room still containing barrels of unidentifiable preserved foods that are either perfectly safe or immediately lethal, and you wisely decide not to investigate which. The Romans had a concept called genius loci, the spirit of a place, and if Hogwarts has a genius loci, it's probably exhausted from dealing with 1,000 years of teenage drama and magical accidents, though it keeps showing up for work anyway because buildings apparently have a stronger sense of duty than most people. You navigate past carved reliefs showing scenes from magical history, including the defeat of the giant Gorgon in 1234 and the Great Pixie Uprising of 1589, events that seemed monumentally important at the time but are now just decorative elements that most students walk past without noticing. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. You pause at this thought and consider how magical spaces like Hogwarts exist in stories shared across the entire globe, connecting people who will never meet through shared imagination about hidden chambers and secret passages. The passage opens into a larger cavern that appears to be natural rather than constructed, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls and pools of still water reflecting your wand light in perfect mirror images. Medieval chronicles mention that the Hogwarts founders intentionally incorporated natural cave systems into their design, believing that areas where the earth itself was already magical would enhance the castle's overall power, which is either sophisticated magical theory or just a convenient excuse for not having to dig as much. You examine the walls of this natural chamber and notice primitive paintings that predate the castle by millennia, ochre and charcoal images of deer and hunters, and symbols whose meanings are lost to time. The presence of these ancient artworks suggests that humans recognize this place as special long before wizards built anything here. That the magic of this location drew people across centuries and cultures, making Hogwarts just the latest in a long line of human responses to the power concentrated in these Scottish hills. You discover evidence of a spring that feeds into an underground stream, its water remarkably clear and cold, tasting of minerals and depth when you cautiously take a sip, following the ancient traveler's wisdom that moving water is usually safe, though you realize medieval magical travelers might have had a different threshold for safe than modern students. Current research by the Department of Magical Geological Services indicates that Hogwarts sits atop a nexus of at least 7 major ley lines, channels of concentrated magical energy that crisscross Britain like an invisible power grid, which explains both why the location is so magically potent and why compasses behave strangely within 5 miles of the castle. You navigate through a section where the passage has been carved to follow the natural fault lines in the rock, the builders working with the stone rather than against it, creating a space that feels organic despite being obviously artificial. The medieval understanding of architecture was fundamentally different from modern conceptions, viewing buildings not as human impositions on nature but as collaborations with it, structures that grew from the earth rather than being placed upon it, which sounds poetic, until you realize it sometimes meant, we built on this fault line because the rock was softer there, and now everything shifts during thunderstorms. You spot more evidence of ancient human presence, worked flint tools, fragments of pottery that predate the Roman occupation by centuries, suggesting that this cave system has been used by humans for at least 5,000 years. The continuity of human occupation at this site, from Neolithic hunters to Bronze Age traders to Roman soldiers to medieval wizards to modern students, creates a timeline so deep that it makes your own life feel like barely a heartbeat, here and gone in the vast story of this place. You examine scratches on the cave walls that might be tally marks or might be decorative or might be early attempts at writing, the 3 possibilities not mutually exclusive because humans have always been creatures who count things, make things beautiful, and try to communicate across time. Archaeological debates focus on whether the magical properties of this location attracted human settlement or whether human presence over millennia somehow created the magical properties through accumulated belief and ritual, a chicken and egg argument that probably has no answer but keeps graduate students employed. You discover a side chamber containing what appears to be a medieval hermit's cell, a small carved space with a stone shelf for sleeping and niches for candles and books, suggesting someone once chose to live down here in the darkness and silence, either seeking enlightenment or fleeing something worse, though the result might be the same. The practice of religious seclusion in caves and hidden places was common in medieval Christianity, hermits withdrawing from society to focus on prayer and contemplation, though you suspect magical hermits probably had additional motivations involving experiments they didn't want observed, or the kind of antisocial personality that modern society would address with therapy rather than encouraging with cave-based isolation. You navigate past evidence of medieval mining operations, places where wizards extracted various minerals and crystals for magical purposes. The extraction sites now empty except for scorch marks and residual enchantments that make your hair stand up when you pass too close. Current magical theorists debate whether the castle's protective enchantments are powered by the natural ley line energy or whether they require active maintenance by the headmaster. Though recent evidence suggests both are true, the enchantments drawing power from the earth, but requiring regular adjustment and repair like any complex system. You examine a section where someone, probably in the 1600s based on the carving style, created a small shrine to various magical saints and guardians. Their names worn smooth by centuries of reverent or desperate touching by students seeking protection or luck before exams. The human need to create sacred spaces in hidden places reflects a deep psychological drive to find or make locations where the normal rules don't apply, where prayer or magic or sheer desperate hoping might work better than in the ordinary world, which explains both cathedrals and secret student shrines equally well. You discover fragments of what might be a medieval magical chess set, the pieces carved from stone and imbued with animation enchantments that have long since faded, leaving only static kings and queens frozen in positions of eternal stalemate. The passage narrows here, forcing you to squeeze through a gap that might have been comfortable for medieval people, who were generally shorter than modern humans, but which makes you briefly question your recent dessert choices before you pop through to the other side. Medieval records indicate that the castle's passages were periodically mapped by ambitious students or professors, resulting in at least a dozen different complete maps that contradict each other wildly and are all simultaneously correct because the castle's layout apparently changes over time, or the map makers were terrible at their jobs, or both. You spot evidence of Victorian-era gaslighting that was briefly installed in some passages before everyone realized that gas lamps and ancient magical architecture created an excellent opportunity for explosions, resulting in a hasty return to more traditional magical lighting methods that don't leak flammable gases into enclosed spaces. The scholarly consensus holds that Hogwarts contains significantly more hidden space than revealed space, with some estimates suggesting that as much as 60% of the castle's volume is composed of secret passages, hidden chambers, and forgotten rooms, which means students technically spend their days inside what amounts to a very large Swiss cheese made of stone and regret. You discover a chamber containing what appears to be a medieval alchemical laboratory, its equipment long since removed, but the scorch marks and strange stains suggesting experiments that were either highly successful or highly dangerous, though in alchemy those outcomes are often identical. The medieval practice of alchemy combined practical chemistry with mystical philosophy, seeking to transform not just lead into gold, but the practitioner's soul from base to refined, which sounds noble, until you realize it mostly involved poisoning yourself with mercury vapor while maintaining a positive attitude about personal transformation. You examine evidence of water damage from what must have been a significant flood, probably in the 1700s, that filled these passages and then slowly drained away, leaving behind deposits of mineral crystals and the desiccated remains of things that should not have been swimming in underground waterways. Current debates among magical historians focus on whether the castle's founders intended for it to remain in use for 1,000 years, or whether they expected it to last maybe a century or two, with its continued existence being either a testament to excellent construction or the magical equivalent of duct tape and stubbornness keeping everything together. You navigate through a section where the passage opens into what appears to be a natural amphitheater, a circular chamber with excellent acoustics where echoes return in perfect harmony, suggesting medieval students used this space for secret performances or meetings where they didn't want to be overheard by the castle above. The human tendency to create hidden social spaces, from speakeasies to secret clubs to underground passages that become unofficial gathering spots, reflects a need for places beyond official control, where rules can be temporarily suspended and identities can be tried on like costumes before the return to ordinary life. You discover more evidence of ancient art, including what might be a Bronze Age carving of a spiral pattern that appears in cultures worldwide, its meaning debated by archaeologists who argue about whether it represents the sun, water, consciousness, or just looked really cool to the person with the chisel. The spiral's presence here, thousands of years before Hogwarts, reminds you that humans have been drawing spirals in caves since we figured out how to hold tools, the pattern apparently satisfying something deep in our psychology that transcends culture and time. You examine a section where medieval stonework has been carved to incorporate the natural rock face, creating a seamless transition between human construction and geological formation, as if the builders wanted to suggest the castle grew here rather than being built, which is either artistic vision or excellent marketing for a school that wanted to appear ancient and inevitable. Archaeological evidence suggests that the natural cave systems beneath Hogwarts were used for shelter and ritual purposes for at least 8,000 years before the castle's construction, making this one of the longest continuously occupied sites in Britain, though presumably with significant gaps when people decided living in cold, dark caves was less appealing than living literally anywhere with sunlight. You navigate past what appears to be a medieval wine cellar, its racks still intact but empty, except for a few bottles containing liquids you wouldn't drink on a dare, the glass cloudy with age and possibly malevolent intention. The practice of aging wine in deep cellars takes advantage of stable temperatures and humidity, though medieval wine was generally terrible by modern standards and required extensive spicing and sweetening to be palatable, meaning historical alcohol consumption was probably motivated more by the absence of safe drinking water than any actual enjoyment of the beverage's flavor. You discover evidence of a collapsed passage that has been sealed rather than repaired, the barriers covered with warning signs in multiple languages and eras, suggesting whatever is beyond that blockage has been considered dangerous for centuries, and no one has been brave or foolish enough to investigate further, which seems like wisdom worth respecting. You emerge from the deep passages into another hidden section of Hogwarts that most students never see, a corridor on the castle's northern edge that leads toward the Shrieking Shack, and you realize you're about to discover the truth behind Hogwarts' most notorious haunted building. The corridor here is different from the main castle, less polished and more utilitarian. The stonework rough and the lighting minimal, as if this passage was meant for service rather than display. You walk carefully over floors that slope slightly downward, following the natural contour of the hill, heading toward the village of Hogsmeade through a tunnel that was supposedly sealed decades ago, but clearly remains accessible to those who know where to look. The air grows colder as you progress, carrying scents from outside, fresh earth and pine trees, and the distant smell of butter beer from the Three Broomsticks, making you realize you're getting close to civilization, or at least the wizarding world's version of it, which honestly isn't that civilized when you think about it. Medieval records indicate that the passage connecting Hogwarts to what would become the Shrieking Shack predates the building above it by several centuries, originally serving as an escape route that would allow castle inhabitants to flee during sieges, though its usefulness in that capacity is questionable since sieges typically involve people specifically watching for fleeing escapees. You examine the tunnel walls and notice that the construction methods change every few yards, different generations of builders adding their sections with their era's techniques and available materials, creating a timeline in stone that reflects changing construction technology from the 12th century to the present. The Shrieking Shack itself, that allegedly haunted building that has terrified generations of Hogsmeade villagers with its mysterious noises and violent sounds, has a much more prosaic explanation than ghosts or demons, though the truth involves a different kind of monster entirely. You emerge from the tunnel into the basement of the shack and immediately notice the extensive damage to the walls and floors. Deep gouges in the wood and stone that speak of incredible strength and mindless fury. The kind of destruction that makes you grateful you're visiting during daylight hours when the perpetrator is presumably otherwise occupied. The scholarly consensus, at least among those with appropriate security clearance, holds that the Shrieking Shack was built in 1971 specifically to house Remus Lupin during his monthly transformations into a werewolf, providing him with a secure location where he could endure his curse without endangering students or villagers, though this information is classified and you're definitely not supposed to know it. You climb the stairs to the ground floor and survey the extensive damage that decades of monthly transformations have inflicted on the structure, furniture reduced to splinters, walls scratched and gouged, windows boarded up from both inside and outside in a futile attempt to contain the sounds of torment that echo across Hogsmeade on full moon nights. The building's reputation as the most haunted structure in Britain was carefully cultivated by Dumbledore and the school administration to discourage investigation, the fake ghost story serving as a security measure that protected both Lupin's secret and the ignorant villagers from their own curiosity, which is either compassionate misdirection or manipulative lying, depending on your perspective regarding when authorities should deceive populations for their own protection. You examine the ground floor's main room and notice that despite the violence evident in the claw marks and broken furniture, there's also a sense of containment, the damage severe but localized, suggesting that even in werewolf form, some part of Lupin's consciousness remained, fighting the beast's instinct to break free and hunt, succeeding night after night in protecting others at tremendous cost to himself. Current debates among lycanthropy researchers focus on whether werewolves retain any human consciousness during transformation, or whether what appears to be self-control is actually just the creature's instinct to secure its current location before beginning a hunt. A distinction that matters enormously for questions of moral responsibility, but probably not much to the werewolf in question, who has to live with the aftermath regardless. You discover evidence that other werewolves have used this building over the decades, different patterns of damage suggesting different sizes and behaviors, making the shack a kind of unintentional archive of lycanthropic affliction across multiple generations. The medieval understanding of werewolves combined folklore about cursed individuals with actual accounts of rabies victims, creating a mythology that was part truth and part terrified misinterpretation, though modern magical medicine has determined that lycanthropy is a curse-based infection transmitted through bites that rewrites the victim's magical signature to include wolf characteristics that manifest during lunar peaks. You navigate through the second floor, stepping carefully over broken floorboards and avoiding sections that look structurally questionable, which is basically all of them, making you wonder if regular building inspections are a thing in the wizarding world, or if everyone just accepts that magical buildings will be held together by enchantments and optimism. The shack's isolation from Hogsmeade, sitting on the village's northern outskirts with no nearby neighbors, was a deliberate choice that prioritized safety over convenience, though you suspect Lupin would have preferred any amount of isolation to the alternative of waking up surrounded by the people he'd killed, which provides some perspective on why he accepted this arrangement without complaint. You examine a small bedroom on the second floor that shows less damage than the rest of the building. A space that appears to have been used for recovery rather than transformation, with evidence of medical supplies and comfortable furniture that has somehow survived the chaos surrounding it. Historical records from the 1970s indicate that Madame Pomfrey would treat Lupin here after his transformations before helping him return to the castle through the secret tunnel, her discretion and compassion allowing him to attend Hogwarts when no other school would accept a werewolf student, which is either progressive education policy or a massive liability that the school governors would have objected to strenuously if they'd known about it. You discover fragments of a journal hidden in a wall cavity, its entries written in a shaky hand and describing the mental preparation required to willingly walk toward a monthly transformation that you know will involve hours of agony, the psychological toll of lycanthropy perhaps exceeding the physical cost, though both are terrible enough that comparing them seems pointless. The practice of isolating werewolves during their transformation was standard throughout the medieval period. Though most societies chose to cage them rather than provide secure private spaces, treating lycanthropy as a criminal condition rather than a medical one, which resulted in werewolves either being killed by fearful communities or fleeing into wilderness where they often became the monsters that folklore warned about. You examine the attic space, accessible only by a partially collapsed ladder that you're not confident will support your weight, but which you climb anyway, because curiosity overrides self-preservation instincts more often than it probably should. The attic shows the least damage of any part of the shack, suggesting werewolves either can't or don't climb effectively, which seems like useful information for anyone designing werewolf containment facilities, though you imagine that's a fairly specialized field with limited job openings. Archaeological evidence from beneath the shack's foundation reveals that the building was constructed atop what appears to be a medieval leper house, a structure where society isolated those suffering from Hansen's disease, creating an unintentional thematic continuity, where this location has served for centuries as a place to quarantine the diseased and feared. You discover more journal entries, these ones from the 1980s and 90s, suggesting the shack has continued to serve its purpose for other lycanthropic students, each generation adding their voice to this archive of managed monstrosity and the exhausting effort required to remain human when your body periodically insists otherwise. The medieval leper houses that dotted Europe were complex institutions, simultaneously providing care for the afflicted and isolating them from healthy populations, their inhabitants experiencing both charity and exile, a contradiction that the patients themselves had to navigate while dealing with a progressive and highly stigmatized disease. You navigate back to the ground floor and examine the front door, which is barred and locked from the inside, in ways that suggest keeping something in, rather than keeping something out. The multiple layers of security ranging from medieval iron bars to modern magical seals, each era adding its contribution to the containment system. Current lycanthropy research focuses on developing potions that would prevent transformation entirely, rather than just maintaining human consciousness during the change, though progress has been limited by the curse's deep integration with the victim's magical core, essentially requiring you to rewrite their fundamental nature without killing them in the process, which is easier said than done. You discover evidence that the Whomping Willow was planted specifically to guard the tunnel entrance on the Hogwarts end, the Violent Tree serving as an effective, if somewhat excessive, security measure that has probably hospitalized more curious students than it has actual werewolves, which is either good security or a lawsuit waiting to happen. The historical relationship between humans and wolves is complex, moving from prehistoric partnership when wolves first began domesticating themselves by hanging around human campsites eating scraps, to medieval warfare where wolf eradication became official policy, to modern conservation efforts trying to restore populations that were nearly hunted to extinction, making werewolves an interesting metaphor for humanity's conflicted relationship with our own animal nature. You examine the shack's kitchen area, which contains evidence of actual food preparation rather than just transformation trauma, suggesting that whoever stayed here during their confinement tried to maintain some normalcy, cooking meals and maintaining routines even while awaiting their monthly dissolution into violence. The practice of maintaining human routines while dealing with lycanthropy mirrors broader strategies that people use to cope with chronic conditions, the small acts of normalcy providing psychological anchors that help maintain identity when the body threatens to erase it, making breakfast preparations an act of defiance against transformation's inevitability. You discover a small library in what must have served as a living area. Books on various subjects, from history to magic to Muggle literature, suggesting extended stays where the resident tried to fill the hours between transformations with learning and distraction. Though you notice several volumes on lycanthropy itself, the afflicted inevitably driven to study their condition, even when research offers more questions than comfort. Archaeological surveys of medieval leper houses reveal that their residents often maintained remarkably sophisticated intellectual and spiritual lives despite their isolation, creating communities of learning and mutual support within spaces society designated for exile, which suggests humans are remarkably good at building meaning and connection, even in circumstances designed to strip both away. You navigate to the back of the building where a small workshop contains evidence of attempted escape, prevention measures, magical and mechanical restraints in various states of completion, abandoned projects that suggest their creator eventually accepted that physical restraint wasn't necessary if the transformed werewolf chose to remain contained. Willpower apparently stronger than iron when properly motivated. Current debates among magical ethicists focus on whether using locations like the Shrieking Shack represents humane accommodation of lycanthropy, or whether it perpetuates stigma by treating the condition as something shameful that must be hidden, both positions having merit and neither offering easy answers about how society should balance individual dignity with collective safety. You examine another set of journal entries from what appears to be the early 2000s, their tone more hopeful than earlier writings, suggesting either that treatment had improved or that this particular werewolf had developed more effective coping strategies, the difference between those possibilities being significant but impossible to determine from fragmentary text alone. The historical record shows that attitudes toward lycanthropy have oscillated between viewing it as a curse requiring compassion and viewing it as a crime requiring punishment, often depending on whether the local werewolf population was behaving itself or causing problems, which really highlights how much of our moral philosophy is determined by convenience rather than principle. You discover evidence that the shack has hosted not just transformations, but also meetings, the scorch marks and spell residue suggesting that this hidden building served as a neutral ground for discussions that needed to happen away from official oversight, making it a secret, within a secret, a supposedly haunted location that's actually a containment facility that's also an occasional safe house. The medieval concept of sanctuary, where certain locations provided legal immunity from arrest, operated on similar principles of designated spaces outside normal rules, though sanctuary churches were considerably more comfortable than the Shrieking Shack and probably featured fewer claw marks on the walls. You navigate through a narrow passage that connects the main building to what appears to be a more recent addition, a smaller structure built in the 1990s with more modern materials and improved containment features, suggesting someone decided the original shack needed an upgrade but wanted to maintain the intimidating exterior appearance that kept visitors away. Current architectural analysis indicates that the shack's apparent state of collapse is partially theatrical, the building actually structurally sound beneath its distressed exterior, the fake deterioration serving the same purpose as the fake haunting by discouraging investigation through apparent danger. You examine this newer addition and find it surprisingly comfortable, with actual furniture that isn't destroyed and windows that aren't boarded up, as if someone decided that managing lycanthropy was hard enough without also having to endure uncomfortable accommodations during the recovery period. The psychological impact of architecture on well-being has been recognized since ancient times, but medieval attitudes toward the diseased or cursed often prioritize containment over comfort, treating isolation spaces as punishment rather than treatment, which modern medicine has slowly been correcting through the revolutionary insight that sick people recover better when their environment doesn't make them more miserable. You discover a small greenhouse attached to this newer section, containing various plants used in lycanthropy treatment, including wolfsbane, which forms the base of the potion that maintains human consciousness during transformation, a development that occurred in the 1990s and represented the first major breakthrough in lycanthropy management in centuries. Historical records show that attempts to find medical treatments for lycanthropy date back to ancient Greece, where physicians tried everything from special diets to exposure to silver to elaborate rituals involving moon phases, most of which were ineffective and several of which were actively harmful, proving that medical progress involves a lot of failure before occasional success. You examine the greenhouse more closely and notice that some plants here aren't documented in standard herbology texts, suggesting experimental cultivation of species that might offer better treatment options. The work of someone who refused to accept that current medical knowledge represented the limit of what was possible. The history of medical advancement is largely a story of people who ignored conventional wisdom's insistence that things couldn't be improved, though for every successful innovation, there are hundreds of failed experiments that caused harm rather than healing, making medical pioneering simultaneously heroic and dangerous, depending on whether you succeed or kill your patients. You navigate back through the tunnel toward Hogwarts. Your understanding of the castle's hidden spaces now significantly expanded, though you suspect there are dozens or hundreds more secrets still waiting to be discovered in the massive structures, depths, and heights. The journey back feels shorter than the journey out, a common psychological phenomenon where return trips seem faster because you've already processed the route and your brain allocates fewer resources to encoding familiar territory, though you remain alert because assuming safety in magical passages has a long history of being a fatal mistake. You pause in the tunnel to examine one final set of carved initials, someone's attempt to leave a mark saying they were here. They existed. They walked this passage and wanted the future to know it, a gesture that's either touching or pointlessly egotistical, but probably both simultaneously. The human need to leave traces of our existence, from prehistoric handprints on cave walls to initials carved in desks to digital posts that will probably outlast our civilizations, reflects an awareness of our own mortality and a desperate hope that something of us will persist beyond our brief moment in time's flow. You continue walking, and your mind drifts to all the students who have walked these passages before you. Generations of teenagers sneaking around, breaking rules, seeking adventure, falling in love, hiding from consequences, each one believing their drama was uniquely important while participating in patterns that have repeated for centuries. The continuity of human behavior across time is simultaneously comforting and slightly depressing, reassuring you that your struggles are shared by vast multitudes, but also suggesting that we never really learn from predecessors' mistakes, each generation needing to discover fire burns and heartbreak hurts and consequences eventually arrive. You emerge from the tunnel back into Hogwarts proper and pause to catch your breath, the familiar sounds of the castle wrapping around you like a comfortable blanket, distant voices and moving staircases, and the general ambient chaos of a building full of teenage wizards learning to control powers they barely understand. The castle feels different now that you've seen its hidden depths, less like a simple school building and more like a living archive of secrets and stories, each stone potentially concealing another passage, another chamber, another mystery waiting for someone curious or foolish enough to investigate. You walk slowly through the corridors toward your common room, your footsteps echoing softly on stone floors that have been worn smooth by a millennium of passing feet, and you wonder how many of those feet belonged to people who also spent their evenings exploring where they shouldn't, discovering what was hidden, learning that every building has layers and every story has depths that casual observation misses entirely. The evening light streams through the tall windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that make the castle look softer than its stone nature suggests, gentle despite being fundamentally a fortress, welcoming despite being essentially a maze, home despite being built to withstand sieges and contain monsters and protect secrets that span centuries. You pause at a window and look out across the grounds, watching the sun descend toward the distant mountains, its light making the black lake shimmer like hammered metal. Beautiful and ancient and patient in the way natural things are patient, having seen human civilizations rise and fall around its shores without changing its fundamental nature. The birds are settling into trees for the night, their final songs of the day drifting across the grounds, mixing with the evening sounds of students heading to dinner, or returning from Quidditch practice, or simply wandering the grounds because being outside feels necessary sometimes. Fresh air and open space providing relief from the intensity of castle life. You think about all the secrets you've discovered today, the hidden chambers and concealed passages, the layers of history built upon history. Romans and medieval monks and Victorian engineers all adding their contributions to a structure that somehow remains coherent, despite being assembled by dozens of generations with different goals and technologies and aesthetic preferences. The castle's ability to incorporate all these elements without collapsing into incoherence suggests either remarkable planning or remarkable luck, and you suspect the truth is probably both. Human achievements generally requiring a combination of skill and fortune to succeed. You walk slowly now, your energy depleted by hours of exploration, your mind full of images and questions and new understanding about the place you've called home for months or years. Familiar territory suddenly strange again through the revelation of what lies beneath and behind and beyond the surfaces you thought you knew. The portraits on the walls are settling into their evening routines, their painted inhabitants chatting with neighbors, or dozing in their frames, or reading tiny painted books, going about their semi-existence in ways that mirror the living student's evening activities, everyone seeking comfort and routine as day transitions into night. You pass through corridors that grow quieter as you move toward your destination, fewer students in these remote sections. The castle revealing its older, more contemplative character away from the central areas where crowds gather and noise echoes. The stones here seem darker, not from reduced lighting, but from age and shadow. Surfaces that have seen more and remember longer. Walls that have witnessed history rather than just housing it. You think about the werewolf in the shrieking shack, whoever it was, facing their monthly transformation alone except for the ghosts of previous sufferers whose claw marks scarred the walls around them, and you feel grateful for whatever circumstances have spared you from similar curses, while also feeling compassion for those less fortunate who must navigate lives that periodically betray their human identity. The castle holds so many stories of struggle and survival, generations of students facing their own challenges, some mundane like failing exams, and some extraordinary like surviving basilisk attacks, but all feeling desperately important to the people living through them, which is how personal significance works. Each person the center of their own narrative, even while being barely a footnote in larger histories. You climb a final staircase, your legs heavy with fatigue, the stone steps worn into shallow curves by countless previous ascents, and you reflect that even this utilitarian feature has beauty in its transformation through use, the way repeated human action shapes stone over centuries, softness emerging from hardness through the persistent, gentle friction of passage. The castle is settling into its evening personality now, the daytime's academic intensity giving way to something more relaxed and domestic, the building breathing out after holding itself formal all day, permitting itself to be more home than school during these hours when learning is officially finished and students are supposedly resting, though of course many are sneaking around exactly as you have been, the tradition of unauthorized evening adventures being as old as the castle itself. You pause outside your common room entrance, not quite ready to rejoin your housemates, wanting to hold on to the solitary contemplative mood that exploration has created. The sense of having touched something deeper than ordinary school life, having glimpsed the layers beneath layers that make Hogwarts more than just a building, transforming it into a kind of three-dimensional history book where every chapter is simultaneously visible if you know where to look. The evening air carries the scent of dinner being prepared somewhere deep in the castle's kitchens, bread and roasted meat and vegetables combining into an aroma that makes your stomach remind you that exploration burns calories and you haven't eaten in hours. Practical physical needs asserting themselves despite your mind's desire to remain in contemplative mode. You finally give the password and enter your common room, the familiar space embracing you with its comfortable furniture and warm lighting, your housemates scattered around in small groups talking or studying or playing games, everyone engaged in the ordinary activities that fill the spaces between dramatic events, the daily life that actually comprises most of existence, even at a school famous for extraordinary happenings. You collapse into an armchair near the fire, feeling the day's adventure settling into your bones as exhaustion, the good kind that comes from having done something meaningful rather than the bad kind that comes from pointless drudgery, your body tired, but your mind still active, processing everything you've seen and learned and wondered about during your journey through Hogwarts' hidden depths. The fire crackles softly, its warmth spreading through the room, the sound creating a gentle rhythm that your breathing gradually matches, your body beginning the evening's slow transition towards sleep, though it's still hours before you'll actually go to bed. This in-between time where you're finished with the day's obligations, but not yet ready to surrender to unconsciousness. You watch the flames dance and shift, seeing shapes in their movements, dragons and phoenixes and abstract patterns that exist for moments before dissolving into new forms, the fire demonstrating constant transformation while remaining fundamentally unchanged, always burning but never the same, twice. Your mind drifts to thoughts of all the students who have sat in chairs like this one, watching fires like this one, feeling tired from adventures like yours, or just tired from being young and growing, and learning to navigate a world that seems determined to be more complicated than necessary. Generations linked by the universal experience of sitting by warm fires while processing the day's events and preparing for tomorrow's challenges. The castle stones outside this cozy room hold centuries of similar moments. Countless students sitting in countless common rooms, watching countless fires while thinking about secrets and mysteries, and the peculiar experience of being alive in a world that contains magic and hidden passages and giant murder snakes in underground chambers built on Roman bathhouse foundations, which, when you think about it, is a very specific set of circumstances that somehow manages to feel both impossibly strange and comfortingly familiar. You close your eyes for a moment and see again the passages you've walked, the chambers you've explored, the history you've touched with your own hands, all of it still vivid but beginning to soften at the edges as memory starts its work of processing and storing and inevitably distorting what you experienced. Because human memory is notoriously unreliable, but also the only tool we have for holding on to the past, imperfect but necessary. The room's sounds fade into a comfortable blur, conversations becoming ambient noise, the fires crackling joining the general acoustic atmosphere that makes the common room feel safe and separate from the larger castle's potential dangers. This small space, holding back the darkness that exists both literally outside the windows and metaphorically in the forms of all the things that might go wrong in a school teaching dangerous magic to impulsive teenagers. You feel yourself relaxing deeper into the chair, your muscles releasing tensions you didn't know you were holding, the day's wariness and alertness no longer necessary now that you're somewhere genuinely safe, surrounded by people who are at least nominally on your side, though teenage social dynamics mean that safety is always somewhat conditional and alliances shift with bewildering speed. Your breathing slows and deepens, your body sliding into the preliminary stages of sleep, even though you're still sitting up, still technically awake. Existing in that liminal space between consciousness and dreaming, where thoughts become looser and less constrained by logic, allowing your mind to make connections and observations that waking rationality might dismiss as silly or impossible. You think drowsily about how Hogwarts itself seems to exist in a similar liminal space, between past and present, between Muggle and magical worlds, between the known and the secret, serving as a bridge or threshold where transformations occur and nothing is quite as straightforward as it appears, which makes it the perfect setting for the kind of education that's really about learning who you are rather than just accumulating facts about transfiguration theory or potion ingredients. The fire burns lower now, settling into glowing coals that pulse with heat and light in a steady rhythm that matches your heartbeat, connecting you to the ancient human relationship with fire, that first technology that allowed our ancestors to push back darkness and cold, creating islands of warmth and safety in a world that was mostly dangerous, much like this common room creates an island of comfort in a castle full of hidden dangers and unsolved mysteries. Your eyes grow heavier with each slow blink, the lids wanting to stay closed, offering the tempting surrender into sleep, though some part of you wants to hold on to consciousness a little longer, not quite ready to let go of the day despite exhaustion's insistent pull toward rest and dreams and the temporary dissolution of self that sleep provides. You think about dreams and how they're similar to hidden chambers, secret spaces in your own mind where normal rules don't apply and anything might be discovered if you're brave enough or foolish enough to explore. Though unlike physical chambers, you can't bring back souvenirs from dreams, except the vague memories that fade like morning mist when you try to examine them closely. The room's warmth wraps around you like a blanket, heavy and soft, the physical comfort combining with emotional exhaustion to create perfect conditions for sleep, your body finally overriding your mind's half-hearted protests that you should stay awake, participate in evening activities, be social and present rather than drifting away into private unconsciousness. You let yourself sink deeper into the chair's embrace, no longer fighting the pull of sleep, accepting that this day has reached its natural end and that continuing to resist rest is pointless when your body has already decided the matter, your consciousness beginning its nightly retreat into dreams where perhaps you'll explore more hidden chambers, these ones made of memory and imagination rather than stone and magic, but no less real to the part of you that experiences them. The last things you notice before sleep claims you completely are the fire's gentle warmth on your face, the comfortable weight of your body settled into the chair, and the distant sounds of the castle settling into its own sleep, the building's usual creaks and groans becoming a lullaby that rocks you gently into darkness and dreams and the deep rest that comes from having spent a day discovering that the world contains more wonders and mysteries than you previously imagined, which is exhausting but also thrilling, the kind of tired that comes with satisfaction rather than defeat, sleep arriving as a reward rather than an escape, consciousness fading like sunset into the peaceful darkness of a night that holds no terrors. Only rest and dreams, and the promise of morning when you'll wake to discover that the castle has kept all its secrets safe through the night, waiting patiently for you to continue your explorations. Because Hogwarts and its hidden chambers have survived for centuries and will surely survive another night, another year, another century, holding their mysteries close while occasionally revealing them to those curious enough to look beyond the obvious, the castle eternal and patient and full of wonders that wait in shadow for the next generation of explorers to discover them in their turn.